This is
the source of everything.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my video series discussing Final Fantasy VII with a Palestinian lens. In the last chapter we focused on Shinra and the material conditions that maintain the colonization of a land. In this chapter we'll continue to build the allegory of colonization that I believe FF7 represents, but focusing on a different character that I only briefly mentioned in the last chapter, Jenova. Now to those who haven't played the game, for all intents and purposes, Sephiroth and Jenova act as one, but Sephiroth is at the helm. Now I'm not going to get into what I mean by that because that's outside the scope of this video series. I only prefaced with that because, as I stated previously, I believe FF7 has two major villains, Shinra and Sephiroth, representing the material and ideological sides of the political allegory that I believe the story tells. But to understand what Sephiroth represents, we first have to understand what Jenova represents. We are first exposed to Jenova in the Shinra headquarters early in the game, a headless, alien-looking creature kept in a Shinra research facility on the top floors that is the subject of one of the most iconic scenes in the original game, the Trail of Blood. We then learn more about Jenova in the Nibelheim flashback in Calm, where Cloud recounts his alleged history with Sephiroth. In the flashback, Sephiroth tells Cloud about the discovery of Jenova. Sephiroth narrates the history for us as follows. An organism that was apparently dead was found in a 2,000-year-old geological stratum. Professor Gast named the organism Jenova. X year, X month, X day. Jenova confirmed to be an ancient. X year, X month, X day. Jenova project approved. The use of Mako Reactor 1 approved for use. After a period of manic reading, Sephiroth is then confronted by Cloud, where he again narrates the history for us. You ignorant traitor, I'll tell you. This planet originally belonged to the Cetra. Cetra was an itinerant race. They would migrate in, settle the planet, then move on. At the end of their harsh, hard journey, they would find the Promised Land and supreme happiness. But those that disliked the journey appeared. Those who stopped their migrations, built shelters, and elected to lead an easier life. They took that which the Cetra and the planet had made without giving back one whit in return. Those are your ancestors. Long ago, disaster struck this planet. Your ancestors escaped. They survived because they hid. The planet was saved by sacrificing the Cetra. After that, your answers continue to increase. Now all that's left of the Cetra is in these reports. Don't you get it? An ancient named Jenova was found in the geological stratum of 2,000 years ago. The Jenova Project. The Jenova Project wanted to produce people with the power of the ancients. No, the Cetra. I am the one that was produced. From Sephiroth's account, the player is left with the impression that Jenova was a powerful individual from the ancient people called the Cetra, the same people Aerith is supposed to be a descendant from. Sephiroth also tells us that Jenova was betrayed by the ancestors of the present-day humans of the planet, who hid when a calamity struck. The combination of the realization that he was created by Shinra using the cells of Jenova, akin to some monster, feeling betrayed by Shinra, and feeling a sense of connection to his supposed newfound heritage. Sephiroth vows revenge on the rest of humanity, starting with the burning of Nibelheim and the killing of its townspeople. The idea that Jenova was a Cetra and Sephiroth was her descendant remains a part of the narrative until about halfway through the game when the party visits the Temple of the Ancients and learns that this history, which was maintained in the Shinra Manor library where Sephiroth indoctrinated himself, was false. Soon after that, the game clarifies the truth of Jenova in what is unfortunately optional dialogue from an actual Cetra, Aerith's mother, Ifalna. Ifalna narrates for us her people's story. 2,000 years ago, our ancestors, the Cetra, heard the cries of the planet. The first ones to discover the planet's wound were the Cetra at the Nullis Pole. Nullis Pole refers to this area. The Cetra then began a planet reading. I can't explain it very well, but it's like having a conversation with the planet. It said something fell from the sky, making a large wound. Thousands of Cetra pulled together, trying to heal the planet, but due to the severity of the wound, it was only able to heal itself over many years. Yes, the energy that was needed to heal the planet withered away the land. Then the planet tried to persuade the Cetra to leave the Nullis Pole, but when the Cetra were preparing to part with the land they loved, that's when it appeared. It looked like our dead mothers and our dead brothers, showing us specters of their past. That's when the one who injured the planet, or the crisis from the sky as we call it, came. It first approached as a friend, deceived them, and finally gave them the virus. The Cetra were attacked by the virus and went mad, transforming into monsters. Then, just as it had at the Nullis Pole, it approached other Cetra clans and infected them with the virus. The one the professor mistook for a Cetra was named Jenova. That is the crisis from the sky. The planet knew it had to destroy the crisis from the sky. You see, as long as Jenova exists, the planet will never be able to fully heal. A small number of the surviving Cetra defeated Jenova and confined it. Even though Jenova is confined, it could come back to life at some time. The planet has not fully healed itself yet. It's keeping watch on Jenova. What Sephiroth told us near the beginning of the game was wrong. Jenova was not a Cetra that was betrayed during a calamity by the other humans. Jenova was the calamity. Jenova was not originally from the planet. She had crashed into the planet on a meteor, destroying a part of the planet. This injury resulted in the Cetra having to leave their homes in the Nullis Pole, becoming scattered throughout the planet. Jenova then appeared before the various tribes of the Cetra as one of them, before spreading a virus that turned them into monsters. It then stands to reason that what Sephiroth told us about the ancestors of the humans was partially true. The Cetra hid from Jenova, and except for a few who remained to face her, abandoned their previous lifestyles over time, losing their connection to the planet and eventually losing their Cetra identity. The Cetra referred to Jenova as the crisis from the skies, and in some other translations throughout the FF7 series as the calamity or the disaster, the Japanese word for it being yakusai. Now keep in mind that the remake trilogy introduces some new details to this backstory. As I mentioned in Chapter 1, for the sake of simplicity and because those details are incomplete until the third game comes out, I will be avoiding talking about them for now. Alright, so at face value, Sephiroth, Jenova, and the Cetra make up a cool sci-fi story. We all love a good alien along with some genetic experimentation. But is there a deeper allegory to the tale of the Cetra and Jenova? This brings us to the thesis of this chapter. While in Chapter 1, Shinra represented the material aspects of colonization, Jenova represents the very act of colonization itself. To put it simply, Jenova is an allegory for settler colonialism. And since this video series is looking at the parallels between FF7 and Palestine, I'll be explaining what that means in the context of Palestine. So put on those political lenses I told you about in the last chapter, and let's get started. Understand though that I think this allegory could apply to any indigenous struggle or case of settler colonialism in our world. For example, the idea that Jenova killed the Cetra by spreading a virus is very reminiscent of the colonization of the Americas, particularly Central and South America, which makes sense considering that the original Temple of the Ancients looks like a Mesoamerican pyramid. Another colonized group of people that the Cetra may have been inspired by are the indigenous Sami people of northern Scandinavia, considering that the Cetra capital exists in a northern, icy area. Interestingly, both the Sami and different North American tribes have a belief that the northern lights are comprised of the souls of the dead. similar to the livestream in FF7. Without getting too much into the question of indigeneity, a subject I am dedicating to a future video, I see the Cetra as a generalized representation of indigeneity. The universality of their depictions in the FF7 series allows those from many different indigenous groups to identify with their story. Okay, but what is settler colonialism? Settler colonialism comes with the typical features of colonization, except that along with the dispossession and attempted genocide of the indigenous, a settler population is transferred onto the land and given hegemony over any remaining indigenous people. Settler colonialism is a gradual process planned well in advance and executed over decades using tactics and policies with the goal of obtaining the maximum amount of land with the minimum number of natives. Expropriation, appropriation, dehumanization, and ethnic cleansing are facets of settler colonialism. Unlike most systems of oppression, there is a lot of gaslighting done by those who try to uphold it. Keep these facets in mind because they will be important later. An example of settler colonialism that should come to mind is the colonization of the Americas by European settlers, and one of the most infamous of the tactics used in the case of the United States in particular was the Indian Removal Act, known to the natives as the Trail of Tears. Notice the very muted language used by the colonizer versus the language chosen by the natives. To the colonizer, it was simply a legal policy of removal. To the colonized, it was a devastating experience, a trail of tears. This holds true in FF7's story. The Cetra called Jenova, the one who drove them from their lands, a calamity. In Remake, Aerith looks in horror as she witnesses, quote, the source of everything. And as Palestinians call our dispossession, the Nakba. I loved Aerith's line in Remake in all of its simplicity, because to Palestinians, the Nakba is the source of everything. And as long as the world continues not to reckon with it, the world will never heal. Now, those who don't know might be asking, what is the Nakba? The Nakba refers to the dispossession of around 800,000 Palestinians from their lands in 1948, along with the destruction of around 500 Palestinian villages by Zionist militias during what they call the Arab-Israeli War, which began on May 15, 1948. Israelis refer to this day as their Independence Day, while Palestinians call it Nakba Day. It is important to note, however, that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were already ethnically cleansed from their homes before this date, and before any Arab army even stepped foot in Palestine. These Zionist militias were terrorist organizations in the eyes of the Palestinian natives like my grandparents, and even to the previous British occupiers, whose decision to abandon the territory was largely due to attacks by these militias against them. These militias were called Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi, which later consolidated into the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, of today, which you will hear Palestinians refer to as the Israeli Occupation Forces. Actually, one of these Zionist organizations, Lehi, which was also known as the Stern Gang, proudly admitted to their acts of terrorism in British Mandatory Palestine. The leaders of Irgun and Lehi, respectively, Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, were behind many of the worst massacres of the Nakba, and would later become prime ministers of Israel. Menachem Begin also founded the Likud Party, of which the current prime minister who is presiding over the Gaza genocide, Benjamin Netanyahu, is a leader. Begin is also famously quoted as referring to Palestinians as beasts walking on two legs. Dehumanization of the Palestinians by Israeli officials was and still is common. Shamir, making reference to scripture, compared Palestinians to grasshoppers. Raphael Eaton, Israel's defense minister in the 80s, famously said, "When we have settled the land, all the Arabs will be able to do about it will be to scurry around like drugged roaches in a bottle." And today, ministers like Ayelet Shachid say about Palestinians, they should go, as should the physical homes in which they raise the snakes. Otherwise, more little snakes will be raised there. Cultural appropriation, for example, Palestinian food being marketed as Israeli food, is a big problem of today. But the appropriation of Palestinian identity historically took forms that are more relevant to the allegory that FF7 paints that I will be discussing later. A common tactic used by the Zionist forces, which is still used by them today, was to appropriate Palestinian clothing or to train agents in different Palestinian Arabic dialects in order to infiltrate Palestinian communities, capturing or assassinating members of the resistance, gaining intel, or squashing protests. These agents are known as the Mustaverim in Hebrew, which Palestinians call the Mustaribin. They typically consist of Mizrahi Jews, Jews who were originally from neighboring Arab countries, and a Mustaribin platoon were even planted in Syria and Lebanon. Palestinians did not want to leave their land, and many did not until they were physically forced to do so due to air bombardment or land invasion. Some became internally displaced while others fled to neighboring Arab countries. Most left because of massacres that took place either in their village or nearby villages, and because of news broadcasted in or leaflets dropped at their villages that promised that the same massacres would be visited upon them if they did not leave. They left not knowing the various political scheming happening behind closed doors, and that they would never be allowed to return. An excellent film that can give you a glimpse into what Palestinians endured during the Nakba, which is based on a testimonial from a Palestinian elder known by the film's director, is called Farha. You can find Farha on Netflix. Some of the most infamous of the massacres during the Nakba were the Dar Yassin massacre, the Tantura massacre, and the Ramla Lida death march, which happened under the direction of Plan Dalit by the Zionist forces. I encourage you to look up the details of these massacres, but will leave you with some of the most heart-wrenching testimonials from Palestinian elders that survived these massacres. Warning, these testimonials are not easy to hear.
قمنا الصبح لقينا عكة محتلة. والله طلعت لقيت مخ جوزي ومخ ابن عمي على الدرج ويشهد الله. أنا ساعتها ما عاد شيء وحيد.
It was the first time I saw the ugly part of the war. Until then, war was dangerous, but it was not ugly.
ولما صوتها تصرخ وخالها كلهم خافوا من الله ويصيح، أنا صرت أنتك كل أبوي يابا وطي صوتك يابا ليجوا كمان بكفي راحوا جزانك أحسن ما يجوا يابا يفعلوا فيك، وأبوي عمره 70 سنة. ولي زمان ما سمعت النزر فيه. وبكل محماس عالدلي والبريق بكل فنجان تا منه انتهى. أخليكي قدر ما عاد فيه.
The word given to these series of massacres, land theft, and the denial of the right of return was a Nakba, which in Arabic means the catastrophe. The Nakba resulted in the largest refugee crisis of the modern era, and due to the denial of the right of return, that refugee crisis has grown to well over 6 million today, and that is considering only the Palestinians registered with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA, a UN organization made specifically to deal with the unprecedented scale of the issue. Actually, the first UN mediator to deal with this issue, Count Folke Bernadotte, was assassinated by Leahy due to his more even-handed approach, including advocating for Palestinians to be able to immediately return to their lands with compensation. As a reminder, Leahy was led by Yitzhak Shamir, who would later become Israel's 7th Prime Minister. While the Nakba refers to that initial dispossession that happened in 1948, because of the denial of the right of return, the truth is that the Nakba is an ongoing event, not an incident in the past that is over and reckoned with. The oppressive policies that I discussed in the first chapter, as well as the current genocide in Gaza, are indications of that. Also keep in mind that Palestinians have been displaced more than once. The initial Nakba displaced Palestinians internally, notably to the Gaza Strip and West Bank, as well as externally to refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and Syria. The Six-Day War of 1967, which Palestinians refer to as Al-Naqsa, or the setback, displaced Palestinians internally and externally again. Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and Syria have also been displaced on more than one occasion due to internal conflict within those countries, which Israel has also played a role in. And now the Gaza genocide has yet again displaced Palestinians. The Nakba was, and still is, a catastrophe, and the memory of it has been passed down from one generation to the next, as we still hope to return. Actually, the key that I have in the background of most of these videos is a symbol of that hope, because many Palestinian families held on to their keys when they were forced to leave, believing that one day they would return. You probably see now why the title of this chapter is The Nakba from the Skies. Now, when I first saw this parallel back in high school during one of my regular playthroughs of FF7, it was simply because of the similarities between the words Nakba and calamity. It wasn't until recently that, even if it wasn't the intention of the developers, I saw meaning to the From the Skies part too. Aerial bombardment was a factor in the initial Nakba in 48, but obviously technology has advanced since then, as well as increased funding to Israel from the US and other Western states. Gaza has experienced aerial bombardment from Israel in 2008 to 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021, and now for 9 months since October of 2023. What Gaza has experienced has quite literally been a calamity from the skies. So, let us revisit the metaphor that I think the one we call the calamity represents. I see Jenova in a similar vein as another popular monster in Japanese media, Godzilla. While Godzilla's depictions have changed over the years, especially in its American incarnations, its original conception was as a metaphor that represented the Japanese experience after World War II. The recent movie, Godzilla Minus One, returns to this original premise, and I highly recommend you go watch it if you haven't already. In Godzilla Minus One, Godzilla is a monster that serves as an abstraction of the trauma and fear experienced by the collective Japanese conscious after the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States. FF7 makes direct homage to Godzilla and kaiju movies in general, with their own kaiju, the weapon that released from the planet after the summoning of Meteor, which are a clear metaphor for natural disasters resulting from environmental destruction. But in addition to kaiju movies, the representation of a traumatic event or negative emotion as some type of powerful entity is common to the science fiction and horror genres that FF7 also takes inspiration from, movies like Jaws, and shows like Twin Peaks. Abstraction is a common narrative technique used in other Final Fantasy titles as well, whose penultimate or final bosses are usually a personification of the struggle faced by the protagonists throughout the whole story. Spoilers for FF9, FF13, and FF16 ahead. In FF9, a story that has the characters grapple with death and the apparent futility of life, Necron appears to challenge the protagonist's wills to live. The final boss represented the very philosophical questions explored throughout the game. In FF13, the protagonists are branded as Lassie, slaves to do the bidding of the false mechanical gods, the Falsi, and in the process are abandoned and alienated by society while being forced to choose between their lives and the lives of their fellow humans who tried to purge them from existence. The final boss, Orphan, is an abstraction of this abandonment, an entity that would destroy itself along with the entire human race if it meant its long-lost creator's return and love. In FF16, the protagonists struggle against both the exploitation of the planet's energy as a resource and the practice of slavery perpetrated by the bourgeoisie. The final boss, Ultima, is an abstraction of those struggles, an entity that wants to simultaneously siphon the planet's energy to gain power over death, while also physically stripping all of mankind of their free will. So then, what is the abstraction represented by Jenova? A monster that takes the appearance of others while also turning those people into monsters. An alien that wants to rule over the planet. An enemy that, in most of its battle iterations, uses skills like silence and stop. In FF7, the protagonists struggle against the inevitable destruction of the planet due to the exploitation of the lifestream by the Shinra Corporation, which, as I talked about in Chapter 1, has colonized many parts of the world. Jenova is the extreme, abstract representation of Shinra's policies, and her very nature is a metaphor for settler colonialism. Remember the facets of settler colonialism I mentioned previously? In addition to being an alien entity hell-bent on claiming the planet for herself, which is a metaphor for expropriation, Jenova takes on the appearances and traits of those she comes in contact with, a metaphor for appropriation. Jenova turns the people she colonizes into monsters, a metaphor for dehumanization. In battle, Jenova uses silence and stop, a metaphor for how oppressed groups are treated when they try to resist. And the story of Jenova has direct parallels to settler colonialism, especially in the case of Palestine. She's an alien entity that people regarded as a member of an indigenous race when the reality is that she was the one that massacred the indigenous and drove them out of their lands. Expropriation, appropriation, dehumanization, and ethnic cleansing. The facets of settler colonialism are encompassed by the monster that is the source of all the conflicts within FF7's main plot. Sephiroth, and by extension Jenova, is also a major gaslighter. Sephiroth uses Jenova's powers of illusion to gaslight Cloud and later the party throughout the game. Remake and Rebirth also double down on this trait, with Sephiroth pretending, however sincerely he may be, like what he's planning is in the best interest of the planet and everyone on it. The Aerith Dragon during the Crossroads of Destiny scene, for example. I could not think of a better metaphor for settler colonialism, especially in the Palestinian context, than an alien that corrupts the land, takes on the appearance of the natives, turns the natives into monsters and kills them, and then gaslights people, including her own descendant, into thinking that it was the victim. To the FF7 developers, if you ever come across this video, I just want to say, whether it was intentional or not, I am impressed. There's also something I love about Jenova as an allegory for settler colonialism, especially as Ifalna recounts what happened to the Cetra. It doesn't make it about the people doing the colonizing. It doesn't center their reasons or feelings or try to justify their actions. Just like how Godzilla represents what it felt like for Japanese people seeing or experiencing the nuclear bombs being dropped on their country, Jenova simply represents settler colonialism as what it feels like to the people being colonized. A violent alien monster that first appeared as a friend before taking everything from them. An entity attempting to take their appearance and heritage while erasing them from history. And despite being the victims, it is the indigenous who are turned into monsters. In FF7, the history of the Cetra and Jenova as told to us by Ifalna recenters the experience of the oppressed. When the player truly grapples with who Jenova and Sephiroth are, what they plan to do, and how that has affected people like Ifalna and Aerith, the player can get a glimpse into the emotions experienced by those who have had to endure the horrors of settler colonialism. Even with the dated graphics, you can see Ifalna becoming upset as she recounts her people's history to Professor Gast. She tells the story to him as she likely heard it from her parents, who likely heard it from their parents. The memory of the crisis, the calamity, is carried on from one generation to the next, and no matter how much time has passed, the pain remains fresh. I truly hope Part 3 of the remake project does this scene the justice it deserves. Finally, the allegory of Jenova and the Cetra has an added layer in that there's usually a religious justification for colonization. In the colonization of the Americas, for example, it was called Manifest Destiny. Colonists believed it was their destiny and God-given right to expand westward and continuously push the natives out of their land. In the current colonization of Palestine, Zionism, while a political ideology, has a religious component, as both Jewish and Christian Zionists believe the land of Palestine was promised to the Jews by God, because they are God's chosen ones. It's this belief that, to them, justifies all of Israel's actions.
Israel is God's chosen people, always have been God's chosen people, always will be God's chosen people.
The title deed to the land of Israel is recorded in the Bible, which gives the Jewish people a clear and unclouded title to that land forever. It belongs to them, and it belongs to them only.
And I think we'd have to go back to God and ask him why he chose the Jewish people. He chose them to be a light to the nations. According to his word, he chose them to bring the Messiah through.
It is therefore quite appropriate that the name chosen by FF7's developers for this alien to be Jenova, a concatenation of the words Jehovah, a Judeo-Christian name for God, and Nova, meaning new. In addition to her abilities in history, even Jenova's name is a facet of settler colonialism. And this naming is actually consistent with the two major villains of FF7 as well. Sephiroth is a name which comes from Kabbalah, a form of Jewish mysticism, and roughly means enumerations of God. And Shinra was derived from the Japanese word Shinwa, which means stories of God, because, as stated by Katase in an interview in 2020, Shinra wanted to become like gods with control over everything on the planet.
というか、ファンタジー要素がない中で SF だけにはしたくなかったので、やっぱサイバーパンクでありつつもファンタジーっていうのを大切にするためにやっぱいろいろこうファンタジー的な要素っていうのは入れていく中で、神話って部分が非常に日本語で言うと神話って部分が非常にこう、ファンタジーの要素を占めてると思うんだけど、その神話って単語からちょっと発想して、今回セブンの敵の、一番の企業のトップはその神話的な神話っていうこう語感をこうもじって、それがこう神話から神羅になった。
はいはい。なんか神羅っていうの、なんかそれはもう神になったみたいな存在。
そうね。だからそれをこう、自分を神のような存在っていう、もしくは神話を作り上げるみたいな存在っていう意味で、こう敵の一番のボスとして神羅っていう名前を作る。
わかりますわかります。
All three of these villains were therefore named with roughly the same intention, as all three of these villains either sought or seek to become like gods that decide the fate of the rest of humanity, much like how colonizers plan and scheme to decide the fate of the colonized. Now, in no way am I trying to draw a one-to-one parallel between the plight of the Palestinians and the plight of the Setra in FF7 anyways, and to be frank, the plight of any indigenous group of people in the real world is going to be much worse than what an allegory, however accurate it may be, can reflect. But there's at least one major difference that I must point out. In the story of FF7, the Setra died out. The Palestinians were still here. There's no denying, though, that erasure, especially cultural erasure, is something that the community is worried about and something that we actively combat against. It is every indigenous group's goal to avoid happening to them what happened to the Setra in the story of FF7, losing their connection to their land and heritage. I want to dial it back a bit and look at the more general theme of life that FF7's story is about. The most significant motifs used in FF7's story of life are memory, legacy, and identity. Like in our own lives, those aspects of life permeate throughout every story told in FF7. The characters grapple with their memories and the legacy of the people that came before them, and how that has shaped them into who they are as people. They confront the various facades and defense mechanisms they put up to deal with their individual pasts, come to realize what unites them, and reach a level of resolve that helps them fight for a better future. While memory can be traumatic, and our legacy is a burden, they're also what connects us to our land, to our heritage, to our friends and community, and to ourselves. And no character embodies this theme as well as Aerith, whose main struggle as the last Setra, as a representation of indigeneity, is her connection to the land and to her ancestors and the responsibility she inherited in putting an end to the calamity. It is also fitting, albeit depressing, that Aerith, the legacy of the Setra, is killed by the legacy of their colonizer, Sephiroth. There is a lot to be said about these two characters in the coming two chapters. FF7's emphasis on memory, legacy, and identity, as well as the FF7 Remake project's additional emphasis on hopes and dreams, is something that I truly appreciate as a Palestinian. That is because the number one thing that Zionists want is for Palestinians to forget and to lose their connection to their land. An often misattributed, but to be honest, ideologically accurate quote by David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, is "the old will die, and the young will forget." Palestinians both in Palestine and across the diaspora refuse to let that be the case, though. We did not forget, and we will not forget. This is the part of the video where I give you action items related to the topics discussed during the video. The first is to donate to the United Nations Relief Works Agency, or UNRWA, mentioned earlier in this video, which provides aid and resources including social work and mental health services to Palestinians living in the refugee camps in Gaza, the West Bank, and the neighboring Arab countries. The second is to boost Palestinian stories. There are a lot of documentaries about the Nakba as well as resources online that share Palestinian stories or facts about the Nakba. An online resource that maintains records of Palestinian villages before and after the Nakba is PalestineRemembered.com. A resource that counters a lot of the propaganda used to erase Palestine from history is decolonizepalestine.com. Some documentaries I recommend will be included in the description of this video. You should also check out The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, a book by Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, and The 100 Years' War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi, a Palestinian professor at Columbia University. Links to all of these will be included in the description of the video. I also highly encourage you to learn about the Nakba from the Palestinians who experienced it, whether in your community or on social media, and to share their stories. That's all for this chapter. See you next time, where I'll be tackling FF7's biggest bad, Sephiroth. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video and would like to stay updated with future videos, please like, comment, and subscribe.
If that's what you want. Thank you.